It was a day that would change everything for Brightwell Enterprises. Evelyn Carter, the CEO of a $9.2 billion tech empire, walked into the lobby, dressed simply and unassumingly. But the receptionist, Ashley Monroe, took one look at her and dismissed her, assuming she didn't belong. What happened next? Brightwell's downfall and Evelyn's powerful, calculated revenge. Watch this story unfold and don't forget to subscribe, because sometimes silence speaks louder than words. Evelyn Carter stood still as the receptionist. Ashley Monroe waved her hand dismissively, directing her to the back. Her face was calm, a mask of perfect composure, but inside, Evelyn could feel the familiar sting. It wasn't the first time. She had been dismissed because of the color of her skin or the simplicity of her appearance. It wasn't even the first time she had been underestimated by someone who didn't see her as she truly was. But today, there was something different. Today, Evelyn was done. Done with playing the game of proving her worth to people who couldn't see beyond their own prejudices. She'd fought for everything she had, built an empire from the ground up, but here she was, once again, being judged by an ill-formed assumption. She had expected this. Maybe she even knew it was coming. But the calm in her heart wasn't out of submission. It was out of resolve. Her gaze met Ashley's, cold and unwavering as she was directed toward the back. The security guard stepped forward, and Evelyn allowed them to lead her, her calm demeanor never breaking. She didn't resist. She didn't argue. There was no need to. The truth, as always, would speak for itself. As she was escorted out, the silence around her grew heavier. She could see the security guards whispering to each other, their eyes never meeting hers. The receptionist, still sitting behind her shiny desk, barely glanced up. The entire scene was surreal, but it wasn't. Unfamiliar. In that moment, Evelyn's entire career flashed before her eyes. The battles she fought, the people who underestimated her, the endless hurdles that almost broke her. But this was different. She didn't need to shout or demand attention. She just needed to make one simple decision. As she passed the gleaming glass doors of Brightwell Enterprises, her face remained a mask, but inside, something began to shift. There was no more doubt, no more waiting for validation. She had everything she needed inside her. This moment of humiliation, this blatant disrespect would not be forgotten. It was time to act. And Evelyn wasn't going to let this go. Her mind was already working, calculating, organizing her response, and she knew it would be swift. No fury, no yelling, just consequences. She could almost hear the shift in the air, the moment everything would change. Brightwell might have just thrown her out of their lobby, but they had no idea what they had just unleashed. Back inside the building, Mark Reynolds, Brightwell's vice president, was watching the entire scene unfold. He recognized Evelyn immediately, but his eyes didn't linger. His gaze quickly shifted to the floor. He didn't make a move, he didn't speak up, he didn't intervene. A moment passed and then another, but still, Mark did nothing. His indifference felt like a slap, a cold reminder of how far removed he was from the values Evelyn had built her company on. She wasn't just any woman. They all knew who she was, what she had achieved, and yet here he was, watching as she was escorted out like any ordinary employee being reprimanded for an error. It didn't sit well with Vanessa Lewis, the only black technician left in Brightwell's ranks. She stood on the mezzanine observing the entire exchange. She had seen it all before. The subtle glances, the whispers behind her back, the constant reminder that she wasn't quite enough, wasn't quite like them. But this time, seeing Evelyn humiliated, her heart clenched in a way it hadn't before. Vanessa bit her lip, her hand curling into a fist. Her body screamed for action, for justice, for someone to stand up. But she knew better. She had learned the hard way. One wrong move and she would be out of a job. So she stood there, frozen, watching the entire spectacle unfold below her. Her pulse raced, but her mouth stayed shut. And that, more than anything, hurt the most. Outside, Evelyn's pulse remained steady. As the door to Brightwell's headquarters closed behind her, she turned and walked away without a glance back. The chaos inside had already begun. She could feel it in the air, the energy, the tension. It was shifting, and she had just made the first move. By that afternoon, the ripple effects were already starting to show. Brightwell's stock began to dip, small at first, then steadily worsening as the hours passed. Inside, the murmurs were growing. The meeting room where the executives had gathered for their big contract signing had turned into a hushed space of uncertainty. The video of the incident leaked from security cameras began circulating. Ashley Monroe's face, the smug, dismissive expression, was now plastered everywhere. Social media exploded. The hashtag #Evelyn Carter betrayed trended, and the video was being shared by thousands. In less than an hour, the world knew what had happened. But Brightwell didn't yet realize that the real damage was just beginning. The next morning, Evelyn Carter sat quietly in her office, the video now replaying across every news outlet. Her assistant entered, holding a few documents. Evelyn didn't need to look at them. She knew what had to be done. Without hesitation, she picked up her phone. Cancel all negotiations with Brightwell. No more talks, no apologies, no excuses. We move forward with our next plans. A brief pause. And activate Plan Delta. The air was thick with anticipation as the phone call ended. The wheels were set in motion. The storm was coming, and Brightwell would have no way of stopping it. It wasn't about revenge. It was about showing them who they had just underestimated. Evelyn Carter had made her move, and now the world was going to watch. This was only the beginning. As the sun began to dip below the skyline, casting a soft glow over the streets of New York, Vanessa Lewis sat in her small, cluttered office on the third floor of Brightwell Enterprises. Her desk, once neat and organized, now felt like a quiet battlefield. The screen in front of her displayed the latest emails from her team, and the phones had been buzzing nonstop all day. But it wasn't the work that was consuming her thoughts. It was the scene that had unfolded in the lobby this morning. Evelyn Carter, the woman who had been humiliated in front of everyone. Vanessa had seen it all. Vanessa leaned back in her chair, her fingers tapping restlessly on the edge of her desk. Her mind replayed the moment when she had seen Evelyn's face, calm and composed, as she was escorted out by security. For a brief moment, Vanessa had wanted to shout, to run down and stop them, to say something. But she had stayed still, just like she always did. It wasn't that she didn't care. It was that, deep down, she knew that saying something could cost her everything. She had worked at Brightwell for 6 years, long enough to know how things worked in this world. She had learned the art of silence, of blending in, of not rocking the boat. She had seen how people like Evelyn were dismissed, how their achievements were minimized, simply because they didn't fit the mold of what Brightwell's elite leadership deemed worthy. But today, something inside her had snapped. She couldn't put her finger on it, but the injustice of it all, the way Evelyn was treated like a nobody, had shaken her in a way she couldn't ignore. It wasn't just about Evelyn. It was about Vanessa, too. She had been overlooked, talked down to, and brushed aside time and time again. She had worked twice as hard as everyone else, only to see her efforts credited to others. She had watched as her ideas were stolen, her contributions erased. She had endured the whispers behind her back, the side glances, the subtle racism that crept into the way people looked at her. But she had always kept her head down, believing that if she just played by the rules, if she just waited long enough, she would get her moment. But today, something felt different. Seeing Evelyn humiliated in front of everyone, without a single person stepping in to help, made Vanessa realize something she hadn't allowed herself to acknowledge before. This was never going to change if people like her kept silent. Evelyn had spent her life building a legacy, a company, and yet here she was, treated like a criminal just for walking into a lobby. It hit Vanessa harder than she expected. It was like a mirror had been held up to her own life. Vanessa pushed away from her desk, standing up abruptly, her breath quickening as she walked over to the window. The city sprawled out beneath her, a web of lives intertwined in ways that she could never truly understand. But as she looked out at the people rushing by, all caught up in their own stories, she knew that things had to change. She couldn't stay silent anymore. Evelyn Carter's face was still etched in her mind, her calm demeanor despite the injustice. It was a face of strength, a strength Vanessa hadn't allowed herself to embrace, but one she knew she had in her. What if she could do the same? What if she could step into the light and stop hiding in the shadows of a system that never truly saw her? It was a terrifying thought, but it was one that had been growing in her chest all day. Her phone buzzed again, snapping her out of her reverie. It was an email from her colleague, asking about a presentation for the upcoming meeting. But Vanessa didn't look at it. Her mind was elsewhere now, racing with thoughts of what had happened that morning and what was to come. Meanwhile, across the city, Evelyn Carter sat quietly in her office, her fingers lightly tapping against the polished wood of her desk. The video had gone viral. It was already making its rounds on social media, spreading like wildfire. Her calm reaction to the humiliation had only fueled the fire. The world was watching, and Evelyn knew exactly what she was going to do next. She didn't believe in revenge. No, Evelyn Carter wasn't about revenge. She didn't need to yell or scream or make a scene, but she did believe in consequences. And those who had wronged her, and those who had allowed it to happen, would feel the weight of those consequences. She wasn't going to let this slide. She wasn't going to let Brightwell get away with treating her like that. But Evelyn also knew that her actions were bigger than just this one incident. They were a statement that would reverberate throughout the corporate world. It was about more than just one company's downfall. It was about forcing change in an industry that had long been built on inequality. Evelyn wasn't naive. She knew what it would take to bring Brightwell to its knees. But she also knew that this wasn't just about getting back at them. This was about creating a future where no one, no matter their skin color, no matter their gender, was ever treated like that again. She sat back in her chair, taking a deep breath as she thought about the events of the day. There was a sense of calm that washed over her, knowing that she had already set the wheels in motion. But there was also a quiet determination. She wasn't going to let the system win. She had built her empire from scratch, and she wasn't going to stop now. Evelyn picked up her phone and made the call. The world would see the power of quiet strength, the kind that didn't need to shout to be heard. It was time for Brightwell, and the entire corporate world, to learn that respect was not a request. It was a requirement, and those who failed to understand that would be left behind. Back at Brightwell, the tension in the air was palpable. The execs were still reeling from the fallout. Mark Reynolds, feeling the weight of his earlier actions, sat in his office, his hands trembling as he went over the emails. He could feel the heat of the situation intensifying, and he knew things were about to get a whole lot worse. He glanced at his phone. There was a message from Richard Lawson. The CEO was panicking, scrambling to save the company. But Mark knew. It was too late. The damage had already been done. Evelyn Carter had made her move, and Brightwell would never recover from it. The question now was, would Vanessa join her? Would she finally step into the light, leaving behind the silence that had kept her hidden for so long? As the day wore on, the pieces were falling into place. The storm had started, and no one at Brightwell, especially those who had stayed silent, could avoid its impact. The real question was, who would be left standing when the dust finally settled? Vanessa felt her phone buzz again. This time, it was a message from Evelyn. "We'll meet soon. You'll be part of something bigger than anything you've ever imagined." Vanessa's heart skipped a beat. This was the moment, this was her chance. Would she walk into the storm or stay where it was safe? She knew what she had to do. Vanessa sat at her desk, her hands gripping the edge of the table as she tried to steady her breath. The events of the morning were still fresh in her mind, and the weight of the decision she was about to make pressed heavily on her chest. She glanced at the screen in front of her, where the video of Evelyn Carter's humiliation played over and over. She couldn't tear her eyes away. Every time she saw Evelyn's calm face, the way she stood there unflinching in the face of injustice, something inside Vanessa stirred. The room around her felt suffocating. The walls seemed to close in with every passing second. She had stayed silent for years, watching others like Evelyn suffer in the same way, their worth disregarded by a system that didn't value them. Vanessa had learned to keep her head down, to avoid rocking the boat, to smile through the tension and pretend it didn't bother her. But today was different. Vanessa clenched her fists. She couldn't go on like this. The silence was killing her. The constant feeling of being invisible, of her contributions being ignored, of her very presence being erased by people who didn't understand her value. She had enough. But the fear that had kept her in line for so long was still there, whispering, doubts in her ear. What if she spoke out and lost everything? What if, just like that, she was cast aside, forgotten like so many before her? What if standing up for Evelyn meant losing her job, her career, her security? She stood up suddenly, pushing her chair back with a sharp scrape. Her heart was pounding now, and she couldn't sit still. The walls around her seemed to close in even tighter, the air thick with uncertainty. She couldn't just stand by anymore, watching people like Evelyn get pushed aside. She had to do something. But what? How? Her phone buzzed on the desk, breaking through the fog of her thoughts. The message on the screen was from Evelyn. "Meet me tomorrow. I know what you're thinking, and I'm not asking you to speak for me. But your silence has a cost. You know that, right?" Vanessa froze. The words echoed in her mind, repeating, like a mantra. Your silence has a cost. She had been silent for too long, and now Evelyn was asking her to break that silence. She couldn't deny that something about Evelyn's strength called to her, made her want to take that first step toward something different, something real. But there was fear, too. Fear of losing everything. Fear of confronting the truth about the way things worked in Brightwell and in the world. The next morning, Vanessa found herself standing outside the small cafe where she had arranged to meet Evelyn. She had tried to prepare herself for the conversation, but nothing could have prepared her for the emotions swirling inside her. Her hands were clammy, her thoughts a chaotic mess. But as she pushed open the door and walked inside, she saw Evelyn, sitting at a table in the back, waiting calmly, her posture straight, her face an unreadable mask. There was no fanfare, no dramatic entrance, just Evelyn, sitting as if this was another ordinary day in her extraordinary life. Vanessa hesitated for a moment, but then she stepped forward, her feet carrying her to the table. Evelyn looked up, her eyes meeting Vanessa's with quiet intensity. She didn't say anything at first, just gestured for Vanessa to sit down. "I know what you're thinking," Evelyn said, her voice low and steady. "You've been in my shoes before. The silence, the fear, the pressure to stay quiet, to play the game and not rock the boat. But the truth is, Vanessa, silence doesn't protect you. It never has. And now it's time to stop pretending we don't see the system for what it is." Vanessa swallowed hard, the weight of Evelyn's words sinking in. She had heard the whispers. She had seen the way things worked at Brightwell, how people like her, like Evelyn, were pushed aside or ignored, not because they didn't belong, but because the system wasn't built for them. And Vanessa had been a part of that. She had stayed quiet, turned a blind eye because that was the way to survive. But now, Evelyn was asking her to make a choice. "You don't have to say anything right now," Evelyn continued, her voice a gentle but firm reminder. "But I need you to know that there is more at stake than just this company. There's a bigger picture. And you, Vanessa, you're a part of it. You don't have to stand on the sidelines anymore. You can be a part of the change." Vanessa felt a lump form in her throat. This wasn't just about standing up for Evelyn. It was about standing up for herself, for everything she had endured, for all the moments she had swallowed her pride and stayed silent, hoping things would get better on their own. She realized then that it wasn't just Brightwell that needed to change. It was the entire culture, the way people like her were treated, dismissed, and erased. "I'm scared," Vanessa confessed, her voice barely a whisper. What if I lose everything? What if I'm not enough? What if I fail? Evelyn smiled softly, a knowing look in her eyes. It's okay to be scared, but don't let that fear control you. Sometimes it takes one small action to set everything in motion. And sometimes the right thing is the hardest thing to do. Vanessa sat back in her chair, the weight of Evelyn's words settling over her like a blanket of truth. She knew what she had to do now. It wouldn't be easy and it wouldn't be quick, but it was the only way forward. As they finished their conversation, Evelyn gave her one last piece of advice. You can't change what happened, but you can shape what comes. Next, the question is, will you? Vanessa nodded, a quiet resolve settling in her chest. She had always been a part of the system, silently complicit in its flaws. But now she had a chance to be something more. She stood up, shaking Evelyn's hand firmly, a silent promise passing between them. Thank you, Vanessa said softly, for believing in me. The next day, the ripple effect began. Vanessa stood in front of her colleagues at Brightwell, ready to confront the truth she had hidden from for so long. She didn't know what the future held, but one thing was certain. She was no longer afraid to be seen. And as the words left her lips, a new chapter began for both her and Evelyn, a chapter where silence was no longer an option. The storm had passed, but its effects rippled through Brightwell Enterprises like a tidal wave. The building that once stood tall, a symbol of corporate power and wealth, now felt hollow. Inside, the executives who had once ruled the company with arrogance and indifference were crumbling under the weight of their own actions. Mark Reynolds, the man who had once thought he could control the narrative, now found himself a prisoner of his own deceit. Richard Lawson, the CEO who had turned a blind eye to the injustices happening under his watch, had been suspended, a silent acknowledgement that his leadership was no longer viable. The boardroom, once a place of decisions made behind closed doors, was now a courtroom where the truth had been exposed for all to see. Evelyn Carter had watched it all unfold from her office, the calmness of her demeanor belying the storm that had torn through the hearts of Brightwell's leadership. She had not sought revenge. She had not needed to shout or make noise. Her actions had been deliberate, precise, and calculated. Evelyn knew that sometimes the most powerful weapon was silence. She didn't need to raise her voice to make them listen. She simply had to make them see. And they had seen. As the days passed, Brightwell's fall became the topic of every conversation. News outlets, social media, and corporate circles buzzed with the story of how a single act of dismissal had led to the company's undoing. The viral video of Evelyn being escorted out of the lobby had sparked outrage, but it was the aftermath, the way she had dismantled Brightwell from the inside out, that truly captured the world's attention. It wasn't just about the company's financial ruin. It was about what Evelyn had done to expose the deep-seated racism, prejudice, and toxic corporate culture that had allowed it all to happen. For Evelyn, the end of Brightwell was not a victory, it was a lesson. A lesson in the power of self-respect, dignity, and the ability to stand up for what was right, no matter the cost. She had always known that the path she walked would not be easy, but she also knew it was the only path worth taking. And through it all, Vanessa Lewis had found her own voice. She had watched Evelyn, quietly admiring her strength, her grace under pressure, and her unwavering determination to make a change. Vanessa had been on the verge of staying silent, of continuing to endure the injustices that surrounded her. But Evelyn had given her the courage to speak up, to stand up for herself, and to challenge the system that had kept her down for so long. In the process, Vanessa had discovered her own strength, the same quiet resilience that Evelyn embodied. The Cole Center for Innovation opened its doors. Vanessa stood at the front, watching the students file in. She had become the director, the leader of a new generation of tech innovators who would never have to walk through the back door again. This was their time. This was their space to thrive, to create, and to change the world. The center had been built on the foundation of everything Evelyn had fought for: opportunity, equality, and the belief that people like them, people who had been overlooked, underestimated, and ignored, could rewrite the rules. Evelyn, too, had moved forward. Her decision to reclaim the former Brightwell headquarters and transform it into the coal center was more than just a business move. It was a statement. A bold declaration that she was no longer a silent bystander in a world that had so often tried to silence her. She had taken back what was rightfully hers, not just for her but for every person who had ever been told they didn't belong, that they weren't enough. The lessons Evelyn had imparted to Vanessa, to her team, and to the world went beyond the boardroom. They were lessons in resilience, in knowing your worth, and in refusing to accept anything less than the respect you deserve. Evelyn had shown that real power wasn't about titles or wealth. It was about having the courage to act on your beliefs and to stand up for what's right, no matter the odds. She had transformed a moment of humiliation into a catalyst for change, and in doing so, she had created a legacy that would last long after the ashes of Brightwell had faded into history. As Evelyn stood in front of the coal center, looking out at the students who now filled the hallways with laughter and ambition, she knew that the journey was far from over. This was just the beginning. The foundation had been laid, but the real work, the work of changing the world, was only starting. And as she glanced over at Vanessa, who was guiding the students with the same quiet confidence Evelyn had once relied on, she felt a quiet pride well up inside her. This was their victory, not just hers. Together they had proven that no matter how the system tried to silence them, their voices would never be ignored again. The world had underestimated them, but now it would have to listen. And that was just the beginning.